Today's topic is storytelling, the magic of storytelling. What is it about stories that captivate us? When we were children, our parents told us bedtime stories, which we loved. And as children, our toys came alive for us. And to further animate our make-believe world, we invented stories to interact and engage with our toys. We learn from them how to model being a mother when playing with our dolls, or how to be brave like our dad and fight imaginary fires with our fire truck, or to be adventurous and travel to far-off lands with our toy train set. As adults, we also love stories. Stories have a clear structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they have a purpose, whether instructive or entertaining. Stories draw out and appeal to our deepest emotions. They ground us, uplift us, and can teach us, warn, frighten, and surprise us. No matter what our age, stories transport us. They engage our imagination, and we as listeners become immersed in and integrate our own ideas and experiences into the stories we hear from others. We make them our own. How does this happen? Something actually transpires in our brain that makes stories give us that kind of effect. The first one is called neural coupling. A story activates parts of our brain that allow us as a listener to turn the story into our own ideas and experiences. The second is mirroring. During storytelling, listeners also begin to experience similar brain activity to fellow listeners, as well as to the storyteller. The listener's neurons fire in the same pattern as the storyteller, as though the story is happening to the listener. The third is dopamine. The brain releases a chemical dopamine into our system when we experience an emotionally charged story. It gives us a feeling of well-being, and that is what it makes us easier to remember the story with greater accuracy. And finally, the cortex activity. When we're processing facts, there are two areas of the brain that are usually activated. They're called the Broca's and the Wernicke's area. An engrossing story engages a number of areas of the brain, including the motor cortex, our movement, the sensory cortex, our senses, and the frontal cortex, our creative assimilation of new ideas. So listening to stories is not a passive act. Stories also serve a spiritual purpose in the world's religious traditions. Many faith traditions have an oral tradition. In college, way back in the early 1970s, around 1970, I first came into contact with Vedanta. And shortly thereafter, I moved from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara to be closer to Swami Pravrajika, a disciple of Swami Brahmananda, who was soon to become my guru. In the early 70s, he would visit the Santa Barbara Center twice a month and stay 5 days at a time. Swami would take all of his meals at the convent, and so I was able to associate more intimately with him. I would listen to his conversation, his humor, and a natural flow of spiritual anecdotes and teachings, which he gave throughout the day to nuns and to close devotees who would come to visit him. On weekends, there would be about 25 people at our lunch table. Every summer, senior monks of the Ramakrishna order would come to visit Swami Prabhavananda. And their interactions with him in the convent living room or at mealtimes brought out a spiritually intimate level of conversation. But it was the evenings after Arati that I cherished the most. At that time, the nuns would gather in the convent living room with their sewing, their knitting, their crocheting, or their ghee-light preparations. And a senior nun would read out from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And Swami Pravrajika, in his large black easy chair in the living room, would reminisce about Sri Ramakrishna, Sarada Devi, and the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna whom he had met. Stories that had never been published. Those evenings were so intimate and the spiritual atmosphere so palpable. I was altogether thrilled and staggered to think that I was witness to such a rare and priceless opportunity. At those times, I remember thinking, my God, I'm within the orbit of an incarnation of God, whose sacred stories are being handed down and shared by a disciple of one of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. It was those evenings that made me a nun. What was the magic of those stories? They were reminiscences of spiritual giants, rare treasures, shared only at that time by word of mouth. I began to keep a diary of those stories. One such story was about Swami Premananda, a direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, whom Sri Ramakrishna recognized as an Ishvarakoti, one of 6 in his incarnations. In Swami Prabhupananda's own words, in Benares, Maharaj, Swami Brahmananda, used to ask Swami Premananda to take me with him to the Ganges for a bath, and then to Vishwanath and the Annapurna temples. We went every day for a month. In the crowd, Swami Premananda would hold my hand and draw me after him. When he did that, what a thrill I got. Remember, this is an Ishvarakoti taking the young Swami by the hand. First we'd bathe in the Ganges. Then he'd change his cloth. I would wash his wet cloth and carry his towel and vessel of Ganges water. I used to follow Swami Premananda and would take the mud from his footprints and put it on my body. I had such reverence for him. Those were the days to walk with gods. Before Swami Premananda entered the Vishwanath temple, Swami would continue, he would buy some flowers. Then we would enter the temple. After he bathed the Shiva Linga, he would give me the water pot and I would pour water to bathe Lord Shiva. Afterward, as is the custom, we used to circumambulate the shrine. And next, we used to go to the temple of the Divine Mother, Annapurna. One day, as we finished worship of Mother Annapurna, the head priest of the temple, who knew Swami Premananda, placed a garland of marigolds around the Swami's neck. Swami Premananda's color was beautiful. I have never seen any Hindu with such beautiful golden skin. When he wanted to take the garland off to give it to me, I said to him with folded palms, "No, Maharaj, please keep the garland yourself. You look so beautiful." The word beautiful reminded Swami Premananda of God's beauty, and he went into ecstasy. His face flushed and his mind became completely indrawn. A light emanated from his whole body. It was just like an electric bulb lighting up. Walking slowly, Swami Premananda left the temple and I followed him. The temple lane of Vishwanath was crowded, but on both sides of us, people stared at him and made way. It was evident that everyone present saw his transfiguration. We continued to walk through the streets of Benares while crowds stood still, silently watching Swami Premananda. His eyes were cast down. He was absorbed in the thought of God and completely oblivious to his surroundings. It was about a mile from the temple to the monastery. When we came to the ashrama gate, Swami Nirbharananda, the abbot, saw us from the veranda. He called out to the monks, "Boys, prepare a royal welcome for Swami Premananda." We entered the monastery grounds to the sound of gongs, bells, and conch shells. When we arrived at the veranda of the ashrama, Swami Premananda took the garland off and placed it on Swami Nirbharananda. Then he danced, still in ecstasy. Slowly his mind regained external consciousness and the divine light disappeared. Such stories brought home to me a tangible truth of religion, not as a dry theology of do's and don'ts, but of the magic of spirituality and spirituality alone. Spiritual stories are touchstones for all of us. Incidents in an avatar's life can serve to illustrate for us Upanishadic teachings like no other example. Why? Because the avatar and his disciples are living scriptures. For example, as soon as we come into Vedanta, we ask, what is God? Brahman, we're told. But how can we wrap our heads around such a lofty principle? How can we connect with it? We can turn to a famous Upanishadic story, such as a student went to a teacher and asked to be taught the truth of Brahman 3 times. And finally, the guru answered, I have been teaching you. His name is silence. But again, what does that mean? This truth of Brahman still seems so nebulous to us. However, if we turn to Sri Ramakrishna's life, we find incidents that exemplify this great truth and that bring it home to us. We all know Sri Ramakrishna tried and failed many times to explain Brahman to his direct disciples. He would say, today I'll tell you everything. I'll keep nothing a secret. This is to his most intimate monastic disciples. And he described clearly the chakras and the corresponding experiences up to the heart and to the throat. Then he pointed to the 6th center between the eyebrows. He said, when the mind reaches this point, one gets the vision of the Paramatman, the Supreme Self, and enters Samadhi. Only a thin, transparent veil intervenes between the individual self and the Supreme Self. One then sees, as Sri Ramakrishna attempted to provide details of the experience, he went into Samadhi. When the mind came down a little, he tried again, but again he went into Samadhi. After several fruitless attempts, he tearfully told his monastic disciples, I sincerely wish to tell you everything, but the Divine Mother won't let me do so. She keeps closing my mouth. Their life stories provide us with consolations and examples to live by. Once a devotee was harassed by a bossy manager over minutia in the workplace. The boss was so demanding, and the devotee became desperate for the end to such miserable plight. But one day, he remembered how Hazra and Hridoy, Sri Ramakrishna's nephew, used to boss and torment Sri Ramakrishna, and that gave him great comfort. He thought, if such unfortunate circumstances could happen to an avatar, then I too can learn to live with it like Sri Ramakrishna did, and learn to rise above it too. When visitors would come to Dakshineshwar seeking Sri Ramakrishna's company, Hazra would say, "Why do you want to see him? Sit here and I will tell you about God." Such was his ego. In fact, he used to ridicule the master's teachings altogether. Sri Ramakrishna, what did he do? He bore it all even-mindedly, without losing his spiritual balance. On the other hand, Hridoy, Sri Ramakrishna's nephew, who served him well in the beginning, later became egotistic and abusive, to the point where Sri Ramakrishna thought of leaving Dakshineshwar for Benares. But eventually Hridoy was dismissed by the Dakshineshwar temple proprietor. Once a young woman devotee was mesmerized by a male devotee's sports car and was often seen taking a drive in it. And devotees were scandalized by this young man's intentions and went to Swami Swahananda, who's a founder of the center and who was the head of the Vedanta Society of Southern California. Swami Swahananda was so simple. What was his response to this malady? It was Sri Ramakrishna's example. He called the woman devotee to him and explained. Once Sri Ramakrishna had a desire to smoke a hubble bubble and wear an expensive shawl. He said to himself, this is what is called wearing an expensive shawl and smoking a hubble bubble. Then he gave them away. By following his example, the Swami said to this young woman, go ahead and ride in the sports car once or twice and try to understand what it means to ride in an expensive sports car. Then give it up. The experiences of an avatar provide us with a spiritual compass. We're not fooled by false piety or outer renunciation. Swami Pravrajika said, at one time a millionaire who had lost his wife came to the monastery and said he wished to renounce the world and give all his wealth to the Ramakrishna mission. Swami Premananda reported this to Maharaj, Swami Brahmananda, and he folded his hands and said gently, brother, a worldly man who associates with a holy man like yourself naturally becomes inspired by the ideal of renunciation. Shall we in our turn become worldly because we have met a worldly man? Maharaj refused to accept the money because he knew very well that the millionaire would later regret his offer, being as he was very much attached to his wealth. Moral stories. Moral stories cross cultural boundaries and religious traditions. There's a story of the wise man. People had been coming to the wise man complaining about the same problems every time. One day the wise man told them a joke and everyone roared with laughter. After a few minutes, he told them the same joke, but only a few of them smiled this time. When he told the same joke for the third time, no one laughed anymore. Finally, the wise man smiled and said, you can't laugh at the same joke over and over. So why are you always crying about the same problem? Another story which I love is once a Buddhist monk came to a flooded river and saw a young woman struggling against the current. Immediately, he jumped into the river and carried the woman across the flooded river to the other bank. A young monk who met him at the bankside next day reminded the monk that he had taken a vow not to touch a woman. Yes, you're right, the older monk replied. I carried the woman, but you are still carrying her. And from this story, we see, it's not just one's outer behavior that shows what one is. It's one internal motive for acting that's the final judge. It's what takes place in the mind that determines one's integrity, but that oftentimes lies hidden from the view of others. These moral stories are universal. For example, Sri Ramakrishna's tale of the pundit who couldn't swim was heard by one of our senior nuns on a day she had escorted her old aunt to her Baptist church in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The minister preached it from the pulpit. Imagine. And that was about 50 years ago. Sri Ramakrishna said, this is the story. Once several men crossing the Ganges in a boat. When a pundit was making a display of his erudition, boasting that he had studied various scriptures, the Vedas, the Vedanta, and the 6 systems of philosophy. The pundit asked a poor farmer who was a passenger, "Do you know Vedanta?" "No, revered sir." "Then 1/4 of your life is wasted." "What about Sankhya and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras?" "No, revered sir." "Then 1/2 of your life is wasted. Have you read any philosophy?" "No, revered sir." "Then 3/4 of your life is wasted." The vain pundit expounded scriptures as the passengers sat in silence, when suddenly a great storm arose and the boat was rocking and about to sink. The passenger turned to the pundit, whose face had become very small. "Sir, can you swim?" "No." The passenger then said, "Then your whole life is wasted." He jumped into the water and swam ashore as the boat carrying the pundit sank. Sri Ramakrishna explained, "What will a man gain by knowing many scriptures? The one thing needful is to know how to cross the river of this world. God alone is real. All else is illusory." Parables. How can we get an inkling of God's love? Something so otherworldly through stories and parables. Christ gave the parable of the prodigal son to show what unconditional love is. Once upon a time, a man had 2 sons. The younger demanded his share of inheritance, left home, and wasted his substance with riotous living, the Bible tells us. Then he took work as a swineherd. When he came to his senses, he returned home and threw himself on his father's mercy. And the father greeted him with open arms. He killed a fatted calf to celebrate his son's return. But the older brother became angry, jealous at this favored treatment, upset at the lack of reward for his own faithfulness. But the father said to him, "Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found." In the Hindu tradition, we call this Patita Pavana, savior of the fallen. This is what an avatar is. It's a beautiful story that illustrates the divine love in the Ramakrishna Vedanta tradition. There's one such story that came down through the oral tradition. Boshi Sen was a disciple of Swami Brahmananda. He was the spiritual son of Ramakrishna, and he was a prominent Indian scientist and agriculturist who worked at the Bose Institute as a protege of Dr. J.C. Bose, the internationally famous scientist who discovered consciousness in plants. Well, Boshi had a younger brother, Tabu. Swami Prabhupada told his story. Tabu was loved by Holy Mother, Maharaj, and all the Swamis. But once he did something he felt he should not have done, and afterwards he avoided Maharaj. He would visit the younger swamis and then slip away. One day, Maharaj caught hold of him and said, "Tabu, do you know what buffaloes have big horns? That big buffaloes have big horns where flies can sit and the buffaloes don't feel anything?" And then he opened his arms wide and added, "I have big horns like that." See, both tradition, the Christian and the Vedanta tradition, demonstrate divine love in two different ways. One as unconditional forgiveness, and the other as an expansive and qualified love, wherein we will always feel safe. Parables can teach us about the nature of the world, the bane of lust and greed, the pitfalls in spiritual life, and they can bring high philosophical truths into sharp focus, such as Ramakrishna's parable of the Mahout god, the elephant driver god. Once upon a time, in a forest there lived a holy man who had many disciples. One day he taught them to see God in all beings, and knowing this, to bow low before them all. A disciple went to the forest to gather wood for the sacrificial fire, when suddenly he heard an outcry. "Get out of the way! A mad elephant is coming." All but the disciple of the holy man took to their heels. He reasoned that the elephant was also God in another form. Then why should he run away from it? He stood still, bowed before it, as the elephant driver shouted, "Run! Run away quickly!" The animal seized him by the trunk, cast him to one side, and went on its way, and the disciple lay unconscious on the ground. Hearing what happened, the teacher and his disciples came to him and carried him to the hermitage. With the help of some medicine, he soon regained consciousness. Someone asked him, "You knew the elephant was coming. Why didn't you run?" And the disciple said, "Our teacher has told us that God himself has taken all these forms of animals as well as of men. Therefore, thinking it was only the elephant god that was coming, I didn't run away." At this, the teacher said, "Yes, my child, it is true that the elephant god was coming, but the Mahout god, the elephant driver god, forbade you to stay. Since all are manifestations of God, why didn't you trust the Mahout's words?" In other words, from the highest standpoint, all is Brahman. But so long as we remain in the relative world, on the relative plane, we must safeguard our spiritual lives from those who are evil-minded or steeped in worldliness, and who by association may harm our spiritual lives. Furthermore, there's a vast difference between those who have realized the truth of Brahman, those who are aspiring to realize it, and those who are ignorant of it and who scorn it. So with this in mind, while living in the relative world, subject to the pairs of opposites such as good and evil, we must try to bear witness to the fact that there are also various manifestations of Brahman around us, from the highest to the lowest, and interact with each accordingly. In other words, we must use our common sense, and as Sri Ramakrishna taught, act according to time, place, and circumstance. Stories from mythology. As a young nun, I wasn't drawn to Hindu mythology because its stories were fantasies, not rational, I thought, with a mind-boggling cast of characters whose names I couldn't even pronounce, let alone spell. But then entered Sri Ramakrishna's oral tradition, handed down to his direct disciples, and those that followed. And that slowly but completely changed my mind. I heard from Swami Pravrajika, who had met Sri Sarada Devi and most of the direct disciples of Ramakrishna, that Sri Sarada Devi, the virgin wife of an avatar, was recognized by Sri Ramakrishna and the direct disciples as a divine consort of Sri Ramakrishna, his Shakti power. On rare occasions, she referred to herself as Kali, Bhagavati, Sita, and Radha, the divine consort of Sri Krishna. Swami Vivekananda was recognized by Ramakrishna to be from the realm of the seven sages. Swami Brahmananda, Rakal, was the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, the mind-born son of Sri Ramakrishna, the shepherd boy of Vrindavan. Sri Ramakrishna told other disciples that once Rakal understood from whence he came, he would leave his body. In fact, when Swami Sardananda was writing the life of Sri Ramakrishna, and he mentioned in the writing that Rakal was the shepherd boy of Vrindavan, one of the other direct disciples said, no, strike that. Once he hears that, he will know that and leave this plane. Swami Shivananda was with Buddha during his life. Swami Yogananda was Arjuna. Swami Akhandananda told Swami Prabhupada himself that he was Yashoda, Sri Krishna's foster mother in his previous incarnation. Swami Ramakrishnananda and Sardananda were disciples of Christ, St. John and St. Peter. And when Swami Sardananda was coming to the West, he went into the Vatican and went into Samadhi. Swami Premananda was a gopi of Krishna and also attendant of the Divine Mother. Sri Ramakrishna used to call him Dulali, beloved of my soul. Swami Abhedananda was with Sri Krishna. And Sri Ramakrishna recognized Swami Niranjanananda and Vigyanananda were with Lord Rama during his incarnation. The story goes, when Sri Ramakrishna saw Hari Prasanna, the future Swami Vigyanananda, he immediately recognized him. And though he, Sri Ramakrishna, was slight of build, he slapped his legs as a wrestler would, challenging his opponent. Can you wrestle? He called out to Swami Vigyanananda, the young Hari Prasanna. Hari Prasanna later related, I was surprised at this challenge. I thought to myself, what kind of holy man is this? But I replied, yes, of course I can wrestle. Sri Ramakrishna came closer, smiling. He caught hold of my arms, Swami Vigyanananda related, and began to shove me. But I was a strong, muscular young man, and I pushed him back to the wall. Ramakrishna was still smiling and holding me with a strong grip. Gradually, I felt a sort of electric current coming out of his hands and entering into me. That touch made me completely helpless. I lost all my physical strength. I went into ecstasy, and the hair of my body stood on end. Releasing me, the master said with a smile, well, you are the winner. This Swami Vigyanananda told Swami Prabhupada directly. Later, Swami Vigyanananda revealed it was he, Sri Ramakrishna, who was the winner. He conquered me. I have become his slave. When I fought with him, he took into himself all my strength. I remember the evening in the convent when our senior-most nun, who was in charge of the convent, Brahmaprana, left Swami Prabhupananda's room after hearing him retell the story of Swami Vigyanananda. She had asked the Swami how such a mythic past life could be true of Swami Vigyanananda. And she divulged how Swami, him being Jambavan, the bear in the Ramayana, and how how the Swami had simply told her, who can understand the eternal divine play of the Lord? That simple statement alone, shared in the evening realm where daylight had sunk into the shadows of dusk, completely upended my incredulity of the mysterious mythological realm of our tradition. It also changed my understanding of our life on earth as we know it, the myth of our personal story. At one time, Pravrajika, one of my Hollywood convent sisters, succinctly expressed this illusion we have lived through so many lifetimes. She said, as soon as we are born, we are given a name, a religion, a nationality, and a race, and we spend the rest of our lives defending that fictional identity. Yes, we are born. Events are attached to that name, and that is called our personal story. Our lives are nothing but stories, perpetuated by memory. And, she aptly stated, that is why sadhus try to erase the deleterious effects of memory and the baggage of the past at all levels of the psyche, and be free to be who they are without any baggage of a past. Sadhus therefore sever their attachment to reiterate memories of the past. How? By holding on to a high ideal, to think it, live it, breathe it, and repeat that immersive spiritual process day in and day out. That is how we try to magically transform ourselves. Sadhus generally don't speak of their past. Why? Because they ceremonially undergo their own funeral service before sannyas. And then they repeat their sannyas vows before the fire of Brahman in the presence of other sannyasins and sannyasinis, which awakens and establishes them with a new identity as pure consciousness and a new name which reminds them of vows they have undertaken and thereby impresses that identity upon them throughout their life. Success in life depends upon our internal life. Lay devotees also undergo a rebirth when they receive initiation from a guru. In fact, when Swami Swahananda was just a young boy, 15 years old, a palmist looked at his hand and read his astrological chart and said, "You have a death date when you're 15 years old." And that was the time he was initiated by Swami Vijnanananda. So this initiation is a rebirth. The rest of a lay devotee's life is framed around that moment when a spiritual seed was planted in their heart by a teacher. And from that moment on, as the seed is daily watered and fed by repeating the mantra, an ordinary person is transformed into a spiritual aspirant and eventually into a spiritual being. As the mantra is worked, it generates a powerful lens through which an aspirant views oneself and the world. And so it happens that aspirants begin to forge new stories in their lives, living more in the present and letting go of past memories that no longer seem real. Daily spiritual thought and action transform the food an aspirant eats into the Lord's prasad, their spouse and family members into spiritual beings, their job into karma yoga, their thoughts as self-reflection and contemplation, their hobbies inspired by their inner life. They have accepted the truth, and that change means letting go of old false stories they have told themselves. And as they begin to narrate their new life, it becomes a story of freedom and change. change, a movement over time from an unripe ego to a ripened ego, a relationship with God. Freedom, freedom of a life lived within, in the Atman, and the transformative effect that has on one's own life, as well as on those whom one meets. This is how we become blessed and a blessing to others. Now I'd like to end with a meditation that Vivekananda gave at Camp Taylor. And this seems an apt meditation considering the topic we have just explored together. It's a meditation on strength. Vivekananda gave this meditation to Westerners at Camp Taylor in the Redwoods. And he trained them in this ancient style of the Indian Rishi, the forest dwellers. And he chose the elements of nature to expand the mind and heart. One of his students, Ida Ansel, related, I close my eyes and see him, Vivekananda, standing there in the soft blackness with sparks from the blazing log fire flying through it and a day-old moon above. Swami said to us, you may meditate on whatever you wish, but I shall meditate on the heart of a lion that gives strength. It was a never to be forgotten night, the profound stillness of the forest, the beauty of the fire, and most of all, Swami, serene and majestic, how unutterably grand he was. So, dear friends and devotees, let us meditate together on the heart of a lion. Let us sit straight. If you're in a chair, feet firmly planted on the floor, your hands held in your lap, like Swami Vivekananda, right palm held by your left upturned palm. And let us begin by taking in 3 deep breaths. Breathing in purity and expelling all impurities of the mind. Let us take another deep breath. Breathe in strength and expel all weakness, all low, mundane thoughts. Let us picture the lion in our heart. The heart is the center of our sense of identity, the center of our being. Let us dwell on the spiritual qualities represented by the lion. It radiates strength, fearlessness, majesty, mastery, freedom. The lion is a creature of the jungle. It has no enemies and therefore fears no one. He knows he is a match for all circumstances. Let us feel that we too are established in that strength. Know you are free. Strength blazes from the eyes of the lion. It illumines our heart and courses outward into the thought channels of our mind, our veins, the sinews of our arms, hands, and feet. Our body is filled with strength. Our mind is established in strength. We know the self, the Atman, fears nothing, not even death. We are centered in that which transcends time, space, and all that belongs to this fleeting world of matter. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace. Peace.